for the audience to see if they want to comment and start the discussion, mostly about gaseous flows, which is what the organizer asked me to cover. And if you have a question about anything else, feel free to start the discussion in the meantime. So I was wondering about one thing that we used to talk a lot about a couple of years ago, but now we tend to ignore, and that's the question of how much of the hot atmosphere actually cools onto galaxies. I think it's fine. Okay. How much of the hot atmosphere actually cools onto galaxies, and is that an important process in galaxy formation, and when does it happen, and can we actually trust current simulation in that respect? For a while, there was an issue that, for example, some of the SPH simulations didn't quite capture all of the physics of the hot medium, so they didn't cool correct amount. And on the other hand, mesh-based simulations tend to mix the phase of the hot phase and the galactic cold disk that tend to overcool things at the interface. So what we found is that in mesh-based simulations, cooling from the hot atmosphere would usually go down as you increase the resolution, and SPH was unreliable. Now we have improvements on all ends in terms of numerics, and do we actually know if cooling of the hot atmosphere is ever and when important for the galaxy formation? Maybe one of the AMR people want to comment on this?
No. No, what I can tell is true that at the interface of very hot and very cold flows which are in pressure equilibrium, any numerical diffusion tends to create a non-existing temperature in the middle, which will cool very rapidly and increase the cooling rate of the hot gas into the disk, and therefore give rise to big differences in how much cold gas you have in the disk between codes. So there is so that's clearly a numerical effect that possibly goes down as you increase the resolution. But on the other hand, there is a physical mechanism which is mediated by fountain flows that has been discussed by in the context of the Milky Way by yes, Fraternali and company, which provides a physical mechanism to basically give you the same effect. But for this, you need a fountain flow. Doesn't have to be a huge galactic wind. It just have to be just a mixing layer between the hot atmosphere and the cold disk, and then you trigger cooling through this mechanism. I don't know what I mean when I say that, but anyway. So the point is, it's true you have some numerical effects which need to be controlled, but on the other hand, you have also some unresolved processes, and at the end of the day, what is the exact cooling rate is not clear, not clearly understood yet, I would say.
I'm glad you brought up the Fraternali stuff, because I was going to mention that. Even if our hydro is perfect at this stage of the game, there's one of Fraternali's papers, I think with James Binney, that showed that the mixing interface of these cold fountain clumps requires like very, very sub-parsec resolution. And so none of us are really at the stage where we can just from first principles have these mixing layers resolved. So we're still in the subgrid phase of things.
As an observer, I like to ask the theorists, what do they consider to be the relevant cold phase? Because right now, there's a lot of observations that are beginning to observe, for example, the molecular clouds. And that's a very different temperature range than I think what you would traditionally call cold and hot. So maybe it's a time that we talk about maybe 3 different temperature range, those which matter for star formation, those which matter for perhaps preserving pressure, equilibrium between different states? I don't know. I'm just asking a question.
I can tell you my opinion, but the audience can also comment. I guess we tend to call the cold stuff, that's what observers tend to call the warm gas. Usually those are low ions at around 10,000 degrees. That's cold for our purposes because it's typically much colder than the ideal temperatures of halos. There is definitely clear interest in very cold material, like tens of Kelvin or hundreds of Kelvins within the galaxies, but we are just getting there yet to try to probe this cell consistently, and I wouldn't actually trust the details of the 10 Kelvin gas in any of the simulations I presented today. I actually wanted to push a little bit more on the issue that we started discussing is what is the phase structure and the sizes of the regions that are observed as outflows from the galaxies. Maybe observers can tell us what are the latest constraints of how big are the absorbers within the CGM and how well we need to do in simulations to actually start probing overall structure of the CGM.
You mean the cross-section of the CGM itself?
So once you have a sideline
Got
back
it.
to the
Centric
CGM,
distance.
how big is single absorber we can do?
In terms of equivalent weight?
The short answer is,
So in terms of physical size.
the short answer is just about the size of the halo. People are finding high covering fractions for low ion states and even for some high ion states that are essentially the size of the halo.
But it's a multi-phase medium, right?
Yes, it's a multi-phase, and there were recent claims from the, I guess, double quasar stuff from Xavier and his collaborators that the structure of the CGM is actually very tiny. It goes all the way down to few parsec scales, and that's what you basically need to do to reproduce what's going on within the CGM.
Right,
So I just wanted to
there
see.
are small clouds, but they're found a large part of the halo. So there's no contradiction between those two statements.
I guess what I was aiming for is if in the simulations we are launching something that is of 50 parsec scales, that doesn't have substructure on a 1 parsec scale, are we doing it right or not? Or how wrong we are doing it. So.
Yeah, I think it was very challenging those observations that see that there's a lot of mass in those absorbers, and so you need a very strong outflow mechanism. And I'm not sure how since we don't really know the size, we know the column density from observation, but we don't know the intrinsic size. And so how do you convert this into a mass? And that's the constraint we have to deal with when we are doing simulation. Is this something very clearly understood, or do we have some freedom it's a very strong constraint to check the absorber so far away from the galaxy. You have so much mass so far away, it really pushes towards crazy strong output.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's sort of the thing where I was gonna say that if you use galaxies probing galaxies, this kind of thing that I think they did in Alex's paper and a few other papers, could you eventually do something where statistics are different when you have big galaxy, the galaxy is a flashlight as opposed to the pencil beam from a quasar, and whether, that's probably some super hard project, but you can imagine building up statistics and seeing if you see differences with those different probes. I don't know if there are observers who've thought about that or whether that's even possible.
I think, again, like the question about the temperature, I think we're now at a stage where the data sets are good enough to show us that the structures that we're looking at are no longer isotropic. I mean, your own theoretical descriptions show that the outflow is perhaps very strong, sort of against one direction and not another. So even discussion about sizes of where things happen will be different, and that adds to dispersion. So you may have a function, say probability about some covering factor, et cetera, but in reality, I think we need to just be aware that there's actually a three-dimensional structure to what might be, sounds like a simple question, how big or how far away are the flows? Well, perpendicular to a very powerful thing where there's a jet that sticks out almost a megaparsec, very different structure than maybe a small galaxy, which may have perhaps more isotropic outflow. So I think even a simple parameter like distance is no longer as simple as a single number, unless we give some other statistical way of measuring, say probability of this and that with such a covering factor. And I think the theory is also good enough. You're no longer dealing with only spherical cows. I think we're both in the same regime. The quality of the data and the theory are such that we can talk about different structures as a function of inclination of disks, for example.
Some of the questions here were actually related to that, asking a question if the outflow should be modeled as an outflowing shell, or we always need to model this complex geometry of the structure. But I know if we should continue, or we should maybe switch for to dark matter discussion. We have 10 more minutes left. So,
David, you wanted to add something?
Actually, I had two questions, maybe connected also to the dark matter. Is there as an observer, I don't know the answer to that question. Is there a convergence between various models on what fraction of the missing, let's say, universal baryon fraction for the given dark matter halo remains in the dark matter halo, and what fraction has been is outside of the halo? Let's say, for example, if you want to predict what Athena would be able to see in the X-rays of this gas, is there a convergence on that, or is it debated? And I had another question, which you spoke about the dark matter, so I wanted to ask the question also on the self-interacting dark matter, whether it can help to solve a little bit of the question of the missing satellites. So if it's connected or not. It's two different questions.
Others to comment on the second part. So the first thing I can just tell you from our simulations that in Milky Way size halos, we are getting baryon fraction that remain in halos between 50 and 85% for 2.5 halos we have at that mass. So it's not very statistically meaningful, but lots of baryons stay in halos, in the Milky Way size objects. When you go to lower mass halos, 10 to 11, you're left with only 20 or so percent or 30 of the baryons. Once you go to dwarfs, then there's really tiny fractions of material that stay in halos. Most of it was either ejected away, or it was heated by the UV background and ejected that way, or prevented from infalling when you go to very low mass halos. I don't know if there is a consensus on that or not, but that's kind of what we see in our case.
There is the Planck results for the SZ versus halo mass correlation, which tends to say that all the baryons are within like.
So the Planck results are showing, the SZ, inside halos is measured by Planck, and when you plot the correlation between the SZ signal versus the halo mass using abundance matching, you find that it's perfectly consistent with a universal baryon fraction. But SZ is very sensitive to low density in the outskirts.
Down to 10 to the 12. That was down to 10 to the 12.
Down to 10 to the 12, yeah. No, but the number counts are more sensitive to the sigma 8 and those. So it's different. It's two different questions.
This is not sensitive to that.
Yeah, but the number density and the clustering is very sensitive to how you play with the mass function, while the content of the halo on an individual basis it's more robust, I would say. But then the X-ray correlation, LX versus halo mass, is consistent with a strong depletion of baryons. But you're not probing the same regions. X-rays, you're more sensitive to the inner part of the halo, basically M500 or even M1000 or 2500, while SZ are more sensitive to the outskirts of the halo, up to 2-3 times the veil radius. And so the picture that emerges is that for groups and Milky Way size and groups, you have mostly all of the baryons within, say, 1 or 2 RVR, but a lot of baryons have been removed from, let's say, R500 or R2500. So you have this intermediate region between this inner radius and this outer radius where feedback have pushed away the baryons.
And those Planck results were very interesting because, as you said, down to 10 to the 12, this suggests basically we see all the baryons. But then people use the same stack data. Anderson et al. Did analysis where they then looked for the X-ray data. And the same model that could fit the Planck data, the SZ effect, could no longer now fit the X-ray data. And I don't know whether that discrepancy has gone away, whether people have, you know about that, Joe?
Yeah, you're talking about the 2013 Planck paper.
Mm-hmm. And then there was a paper by Anderson, 2014 and 15, where they used exactly the same stack, but now they did the X-ray data. Yes.
They assumed something specific about the hot gas and that there were these specific beta models.
Mm-hmm.
And I had always suspected that if they allowed more generality with that, it maybe did allow these more puffy, more adiabatic-like profiles, it could all be reconciled. But I don't know. But if I look at that, they're assuming these beta profiles that don't necessarily have to be true.
It's basically what Roman was saying, the inner parts are sensitive to X-rays. They cannot probably start at 1 or 2 video radii in group size halos.
So I think it was a nice segue to go to the dark matter. Your question about the self-interacting dark matter. I'm not an expert, maybe James and Oliver want to jump in, but I think the question was whether self-interacting dark matter can solve the missing satellite problem. I don't think it has much influence on the abundance of subhalos. It basically modifies the central region, central profiles of these things, but not the abundance. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's funny because the original paper that proposed it in an astrophysical context proposed it to solve the missing satellites problem, and we now understand that it doesn't at all solve the missing satellites problem. It has basically the same substructure as CDM.
So in terms of a discussion on not related to gaseous flows, is, I think one problem that has been with us for a long time, cusp core problem. In every conference you hear about it. I think I was actually very impressed to see now that different simulations, different groups basically get the same results in terms of now we can actually be more concise and we actually say there is this one particular mass range where we actually where all the simulations seem to agree that that's the mass range where we expect the core. And an important question I think is, does this now solve our problems? And I think I very much like the talk by, where are you? The guy from Cambridge. Hey, your name again? Hardy. Yeah. So who actually implemented that and actually showed that it actually goes a long way towards solving several of the problems that people have had with scaling relations and all that stuff. Aaron Dutton has done work in that direction. So I think this really seems to be an important part of the problems that we have had. And I like the idea that now everyone seems to agree at least on how the baryons may be able to modify it. The question is dark matter CDM? We had one talk here only about self-interacting as an alternative, and it's amazing that papers that have been written and ruled it out have now been overruled, and in fact, there's 50 differences come up. I mean, it's amazing. I sort of was convinced that it was ruled out, and I still don't understand how they screwed up so badly in the previous papers, but I think it's an interesting question whether we can rule it out at this point. So I had an interesting talk on that. Angular momentum has always been a problem for galaxy formation. I think now the problem has become more of like, apparently these galaxies have a specific angular momentum that's very similar to what we at least statistically predict for dark matter halos. But we sort of have to now admit that that's more a cosmic coincidence than anything else, because if you actually look at how the angular momentum evolves and how the system builds up, it goes through phases, and a lot of things happen that we sort of ignored in the modeling, but apparently the modeling that we did is still valid roughly, but it's a pure cosmic coincidence. So I don't know whether people agree with that. Is this sort of a cosmic coincidence, or are we missing something?
I have just a comment that for the Milky Way, we know that the biggest satellite LMC is on a polar orbit. So its angular momentum is completely misaligned with the disk. And when you calculate how much is there in the orbit, it's similar to the Milky Way's disk angular momentum. So I think it is, for our galaxy, it's a coincidence if the numbers work out, because there is another component we are completely ignoring.
Yeah, no, if you look at the angular momentum of gas, it's a mess. If you look at how these things build up, it's a complete chaos, and disks flip over and things turn around, and yet, at the end, statistically, so thank you, whoever made this work. Substructure, too big to fail. I think for a few years that was, for me at least, the most nagging problem, and I think people really jumped on it. I think I've sort of come around a little bit. I think now, several people have pointed out the baryonic effects and how you can make cusps and cores, and it's probably one of these problems that, again, ultimately has a solution in the baryonic sector. Related to substructure, the one thing that is currently of interest to me is whether I can actually trust simulations, in particular regarding substructure disruption. I don't know whether anyone wants to say something about that. I can just mention that several people, Pierre Dow and Jörg Diemant and others, have pointed out again and again that NFW subhalos, when you throw them in a potential, they should survive. There should always be a little nugget surviving. That's not what you see happening in Bolshoi. In Bolshoi, you see halos, subhalos with 10 to the 4 particles disappear from one output to the other, and they just get disrupted. And is that because there's something wrong with the force resolution in the simulations or not? All I wanted to point out is it's very important that we actually figure this out, because if people do subhalo abundance matching, what they do is they take halos that they see in the simulation and they look at what are the accretion properties, but if only half of the halos survive, then all the subhalo abundance matching results will be very sensitive to that. So I think,
yeah, I mean, I agree. We don't know the answer to that. I mean, we've been looking fairly carefully at some of the resolution requirements that you need for subhalo abundance matching, and I mean, I would say that they are much more stringent than we and most people have been applying. If you actually want convergence with higher resolution simulations. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to your global question, but I think we should be more worried than we have been.
Yeah. Good.
But at the same time, when you use those same simulations and tag galaxies and do reasonable things, you get correlation functions that look perfect down to very small scales. So I mean, if the simulations are getting it wrong, is it just a lucky coincidence that it matches the universe, or what?
Yeah. If you allow for one cosmic coincidence, you allow for many.
Yeah. But I mean, if there's twice as many subhalos that screw things up.
Well, it's more than that, right? It's also the fact that if you look at dark matter substructure, we know that the radial distribution of subhalos in any simulation is very chord. And if you look at the radial distribution of satellite galaxies in a big cluster, it's not chord. Okay?
But
so the fact that we claim that we can, with subhalo abundance matching, that we can reproduce the clustering on small scales, I mean, I don't understand that. Either it means we're not going small enough, or that something must be wrong, because any subhalo abundance matching will, by construction, have a radial profile for the satellite galaxy that is chord, which is inconsistent with what we see in individual clusters.
Most of those studies are only actually testing things down to,
I think up to 200 kpc, right? And I think below that, the problem is also, below that you have a problem that the data suffers from some fiber collisions, which are hard to correct. So
But Volker looked at this problem using semi-analytical models, and actually Volker Springel, and with Simon White and others. It was a long time ago, and they show very convincingly that. So what they computed was the radial profile of satellite galaxies in galaxy clusters. And they showed that if you just use semi-analytical models using the subhalo, and when a subhalo disappears in the dark matter simulation, the galaxy also disappears in the semi-analytical model, then they get this chord distribution, which was not in agreement with the data, where you have more like a steep. And then what they invented was the concept of orphan galaxies, and then it solved the problem. Right?
Yeah, but the only problem is that I have with that treatment is that orphans now are basically, in the simulation, they follow the most bound particle of the subhalo before disrupted, and then they use the location of that particle as an indicator where the galaxy would be. But basically, we're in a regime where we're not resolving anything proper.
yeah,
I mean, people have written several papers where, Doug Watson and others, where they have actually looked at the spatial distribution of satellite galaxies, and they try to actually do correlation function studies where they really try to do their best to correct for fiber collisions. And several of the inferences are that the spatial distribution of satellite galaxies is actually more concentrated than an NFW profile, actually steeper, which I actually find puzzling and intriguing, especially for LRGs. This is work
Yeah,
by,
I mean, in stuff that we're finishing now, I mean, we are able to get the small scale clustering of the bright LRGs reasonably well. Again, down to, a few hundred KPC. And so, but that's in very high
pure
resolution.
subabundance matching.
Yeah, yeah. But
It's a puzzle.
But it does require, I mean, and in answer to James's question, I mean, I think that it is easy to get misled by the fact that everything looks so good because there is a lot of flexibility in the model. Like, yeah, it looks great, but there's a lot of free parameters that you're sort of calling not parameters. And, so if you let those things be free, then you have more freedom to, deal with the resolution effects of the things you're missing. So.
It may also be that in a pure n-body, they ought to live for real, but then once you put the disk in, it's a happy coincidence or something, again, a coincidence.
Feedback effects are supposedly very strong, but when you compute the correlation function of galaxies, you're still using an n-body simulation, which doesn't encode the feedback effects that are supposedly very strong. So
that's correct. But in addition to feedback effects, I think an important other effects, and it was nicely pointed out in the paper again by Adi Zolotov, is the disk itself. The Milky Way disk will do a much more impulsive heating to the satellite galaxy because it introduces a much larger gradient in the potential. So it will be, it enhances the impulsive heating, and that will cause more excessive destruction of substructure. So the baryons can go both ways, and it's a complicated thing. But I think, although I totally agree that we can't ignore the baryon, I think if we can convince ourselves that we at this point do not trust the dark matter only simulations, then I don't even think I want to go and include baryons in my simulation. I think we all need. I do. Right. Okay. Anyone else?